everybody. Here we are at the Freedom Hub Working Group, and lo and behold, we're at the last day here, thereabouts of January. Amazing. We're that far into the year already. But we've got some exciting stuff that we've been doing so far and some great stuff coming up, which Charles is going to share with us, and some really, really good topic for the day. So, Charles, why don't you start off first to fill a little of the initial time by kind of running what's going to be happening starting next week.
Thanks, Jeff. And this is Charlie. I work with Jeff on some health disruption, and for this liberty activism webinar weekly, we have had some great speakers, including Steve Moore and John Goodman, and a lot of topics like millennial marketing and cyber currency. Coming up, we have Judge Jim Gray next week on the big issue of how to reform our legal system and overcriminalization rollbacks. And then the following Wednesday, we have Terry McDonald, who's written a lot at the Foundation of Economic Education on the risks of independent education from the medical profession and from the family courts. It's a bit more specialized, but an issue of grave concern among a lot of innovative parents and schoolers. And then Roman Buehler, a former counsel for Speaker Newt Gingrich, will discuss his Article 5 effort to amend the Constitution and make it harder to pass regulations that significantly impact entrepreneurs. And the final Wednesday of the month, we have Joel Salatin, who is well known among local farm food freedom folks. And that's an issue that's really interesting for folks who want to get healthier food and let farmers be more innovative in terms of selling what they can offer the public. In March, we have another slew of speakers all through the month that I can talk about later. But Jeff, if you like, I can introduce our speakers today.
Yes, if you would, please.
So very excited to have a couple presenters, mainly Dave Beito, an Auburn professor who is well known in liberty circles for this fantastic book, From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State. And that's really interesting because as a few of us who were involved in the 90s on Capitol Hill, the evolving and block granting welfare, no, that was a pretty good accomplishment for Speaker Gingrich and his crowd, but there's a bigger issue over the past century about how do we help people take care of their basic needs. And mutual aid has been around for over 100 years. It's a great way to take care of those basic needs. And question is, why did it disappear? And are there modern examples? Can we bring it back? And Jim Davidson from Resilient Ways, and he's been with other companies like Eldar Capital. He's written a lot about mutual aid too, and he's tried some intentional community projects. So between the two of them, we're really going to get into this topic of mutual aid and how it was displaced. So, Jeff, I think we can let David start it off.
I would think so, if you would. There's a little noise in the background there. So, David, are you okay there?
I'm fine.
Okay, why don't you kick it off a little bit, and I'm going to actually mute everybody else for a quick minute just to kind of cut down on the interference here. Okay. Here we go. That's a lot better. That was actually on Jim's line, looks like. So we'll bring him in when it's his turn. So go right ahead, please. Thanks. Thank you, David.
Yeah, a small correction. I'm at the University of Alabama, not Auburn. A lot of free market people at Auburn. There aren't that many here, but there are a couple. Well, I did a book called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State. It's been a few years, and I kind of moved on to other projects, although some of them relate to that first book. And Tom Palmer at the Institute for Humane Studies many years ago told me about the British Friendly Societies. Well, it turns out that in both Britain and Australia, they had this extensive tradition of mutual aid. Very high percentage of the working class were being provided health insurance and that kind of thing. And so I thought, I'd look into what was going on in the United States and found that these groups were everywhere. They were among every immigrant group that you can name. They were among African Americans. In fact, the tendency of African Americans to join mutual aid organizations and form them was so great that people would, it was almost a stereotype. There was the old radio show Amos and Andy, which, played up on that stereotype. And people talked about how They were lodge mad. They were always forming social organizations. So I looked at these groups, and then the question arose, you have millions of Americans belonging to these organizations. Why do they belong? Is it just because they're social clubs? Well, that's certainly part of it. But a big aspect driving membership in these groups, which were really at their height in the late 19th, early 20th century, was that these were cooperative insurance organizations that provided the full range of services. They had orphanages, they had homes for the elderly, they had unemployment insurance, scholarships, and then they had life insurance, and they had various kinds of health insurance. And in many cases, we have some remarkable examples of health insurance that were provided by poor people for poor people without any sort of governmental aid. And I can go into more detail about that. I just leave it there, though. I don't know if there are any questions or anything, or if I should just keep spouting along.
What was the rationale on why things started to deteriorate, do you feel?
Well, that's the standard question everyone asks me, and it's complicated. I don't think there's just one factor. I think that what you have in the 20th century is a trend of workers becoming more dependent on the government, but also more dependent on their jobs for social welfare. There was a particular form of insurance that some of the fraternal societies went in for, but a lot of private companies went in for, called tontine insurance, which was an early form of old age pensions, like an early form of an individual retirement account. And these were very successful. In fact, the majority of people who own life insurance own tontine insurance until it was banned by the New York State Legislature in 1905, and then the other legislatures followed suit. So that was an early example of that. But what you're getting more and more is an encouragement related to the tax code, especially in World War II, but even before that, in encouraging, in subsidizing the provision of pensions and health insurance and other benefits, fringe benefits, through the employer. And then, of course, what you're starting to get, in the post-World War II period is even before that, but you're getting the growth of the of the welfare state programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and which help to undermine a lot of these health insurance efforts. Big one that I've written about a lot is a black hospital in Mississippi Delta that was run basically by, most of the people in it was a fraternal society, were sharecroppers or farm tenants, and they provided 30 days of hospitalization care in the 1940s for for about $7.50 a year, which would be, $119 now, and all without any government aid. Well, that was undermined to some extent by the growth of these alternatives where people would say, well, I can get insurance through Medicaid or Medicare or my employer. Therefore, why do I need to keep, since I'm just getting by anyway, why do I need to keep paying dues to this fraternal society? A big part of this was also the medical profession, because the medical profession was waging war on what early on they called lodge practice. And this would be basically where you would have lodge doctors, and these would be doctors that would go to the lodge meetings, and they would compete with each other to see who would be selected as a lodge doctor. And early on, a lot of these societies are providing medical care, including house calls. Now, these were not hospitalization initially, for like $1 to $2 a year. And this was very common among a lot of the immigrant groups, a lot of the black groups. Later, they start doing hospital care. Well, what happens is the medical profession hates this because this is paying. They see this as paying doctors, like an HMO salary, a flat fee, and they want fee for service. So they're doing things like, when they're certifying doctors, even regulating their licenses, They're, doing sanctions if the doctor is taking lodge practices, or they're refusing to consult with doctors that do have lodge contracts. Even in cases of emergency, they're boycotting them. They're using all sorts of sanctions against them. So that has a lot to do with it too, with undermining the ability of these lodges to compete and basically undercut the going medical fees. I see a lot of in Mississippi, and I'm sure other places, certification laws are playing a big role, right? They used to train a lot of their medical personnel, their anesthesia people. The guy used to boast, said, we used to take a girl out of the cotton fields and treat her to provide anesthesia through drop ether. And they basically had what people would call licensed practical nurses. They were doing a lot of that, training people on site. And what you start to see in the 50s and the 60s is a big crackdown. In Mississippi, a lot of it's because initial attitude of the white doctors was, well, if blacks are providing their own medical care, that's fine. We don't have to worry about providing charity care to them. But as you get government programs at the state and federal level, where you get reimbursement plans, they're starting to see that as a potential gold mine and no longer interceding. I think there are cultural factors going on here. I think it's undeniable because a lot of these lodges are providing entertainment. They're providing all sorts of things like that. And you have the rise of entertainment alternatives. So I think that there's a wide range of things going on, but I definitely think you have a role that government is playing in helping to undermine these things. Just the welfare state in general, I say this to people who advocate a basic income. I said, look, once you undermine the incentive for people to provide their own social welfare, they're not going to do it, especially if you're very poor. And so there is the incentive here. And people used to comment about looking at American cities 100 years ago, how in the poorest of poorest neighborhoods you had these groups everywhere. And they provided, of course, a big social infrastructure that in many cases has been replaced by, I don't know, atomistic individualism, encouraged by government, ironically, in many cases. So those are some factors that I've seen that play a role.
Some very good insights, and it's interesting to see how the worm has turned, because now we're trying to get back to those basics of that bottom-up mentality as we've talked about here in the past. So thanks for that, David. Before we take some questions, I'm going to let Jim chime in a little bit and see where he wants to kind of take the conversation. I have you unmuted, Jim.
Thanks, Jeff. Well, sorry about that call that came in while we were having your meeting unexpectedly. I agree with Professor Beito about what he was saying. And in fact, both I and Professor Roderick Long have written about this topic. I started researching it back in 2011, and there are a lot of state laws that were passed between the 1910 and 1930 period, which prevent lodge practice, except in the case of universities. Mutual aid societies were actually banned from having any kind of lodge practice, medical services or medical clinic. And so this made a lot of them cease to exist. A few, like the Woodmen of the World, became insurance companies, basically, and sold a kind of insurance, which was then that was acceptable to the American Medical Association. As a video based on Professor Long's research suggests, they called this a crisis, a healthcare crisis in the 1920s. They said that there was a healthcare crisis, that healthcare was too cheap. It was so cheap that doctors, couldn't make a good living, and they had to go work for working men. They had to go and prostitute themselves in front of people who had a committee of working men, just filthy people who labor in coal mines and labor as wood choppers, and how undignified and terrible it is that doctors have to go and do lodge practice, and it's evil and it's wrong, and it needs to be stopped, and they demanded government intervention, and guess what, they got government intervention with the state licensing boards and the state legislatures changing how the rules are. And so in many ways, the healthcare crisis that we've been experiencing since the 70s has been, it's the direct consequence of the government intervention in the market that was supposed to solve the healthcare crisis of the low prices of healthcare in the 1920s. They solved that problem. I mean,
quite well.
You can say a lot of things about the healthcare situation, but they definitely don't have a low price healthcare crisis anymore. So thanks, government. Good work.
What about some of the other stuff that you've been experiencing as far as like voluntarism or mutual, that you've worked on with communities and so on?
Well, I started a mutual aid response team in 2011 because a bunch of people I knew were getting arrested for different things and needing help. And so we pooled funds and worked together. In fact, as recently as last year, actually it was 2017, I was asked by one of our mutual aid members to help with a car, and I was able to do that. We formed these groups and try to get some traction with that, and that was a real struggle because people were like, well, but I have health insurance, and then there was the whole Obamacare thing, and then the government's solving the healthcare crisis. We don't need to be involved. So more recently, I've joined a group called Caledonia, which is organized by my friend Sonora Jack, and he wrote an essay on that's in the Libertarian Enterprise, which is starting another broad-based, U.S.-based mostly, but also Mexico. Jack spends a lot of time in Mexico where he imports coffee from. And Caledonia basically has the same concept of providing mutual aid and responding when someone gets arrested and helping one another, finding resources for homeschoolers and resources for health services. So there's a lot of interest in the topic because obviously people in government are not going to solve our problems. If they did, they'd be out of work.
That's always the truth of it right there too. It's interesting. What do you see as like, and we kind of let's hope for both of you guys, what are you seeing as the resistance or the problems at the ground level? Is it because lack of knowledge on the consumer side, or continual government interference, or just to squeeze every space out of the room that no one else can participate?
Well, I think Milton Friedman talked about that in the 1970s in his Free to Choose television series. The presence of the government with essentially an infinite supply of money and power in any given marketplace crowds out other participants, and that's true with low interest rates. They fix the interest rates through their Federal Reserve System. It's true of a lot of things, and it's just very difficult to be a part of trying a new thing when everyone's convinced that the government's going to solve the problem for you.
What do you think are some of the ways to overcome that intransigence or that apathy?
Well, I honestly, I don't know. I mean, you basically have to give up the idea that the government is going to solve problems that it has caused.
Right.
And a lot of people are very reluctant to accept the label of anarchist. But that's, that is, Doug Casey was a pioneer in this area in the 80s and 90s. And I call myself an anarchist because I am confident that there is no political solution to the problems that have been caused by politics.
Yeah.
So, but a lot of people are afraid of that label. They say, "Oh no, you're crazy anarchists. You guys, are doing terrible things and throwing bombs and wearing beards and um, you know, and that's not what anarchists believe. But in fact, the most violent people are government agencies. They start wars and drop nuclear weapons on cities and stuff like that. Very few
Certainly.
anarchists even have access to nuclear weapons.
I wouldn't think. David, are you seeing some similar problems, or what have you kind of taken away from what you've uncovered?
Yeah, I've had some dealings, and it would be a good idea to link up with the fraternal organizations, people that are engaged in these projects. There used to be a group called National Fraternal Congress, which was the clearinghouse for all these groups. Still around, but it's called something like Fraternal Alliance. But if you Google National Fraternal Congress of America, it'll come up, the new name. And it's been a number of years since I dealt with them, but they were very receptive to things like I was saying, well, because they were just providing life insurance. And I said, well, why don't you guys try to provide medical care and things like that? And they mentioned some barriers to that, but a lot of them was like, oh, gee, that's a great idea. Maybe we should look into that. So I think getting a dialogue with them would be good. One thing they said to me that was interesting on the cultural changes is one of these groups had a slogan, um, people helping people. And I sort of said, well, members helping members. And they said, well, we have a big reaction against that. People don't like that, right? Because they see that as exclusive, right? You're
Mm,
just helping your own people.
right.
And that is an argument that you sometimes hear. You certainly
Mm,
hear that used on this campus, a lot of people against the sororities and the fraternities. Oh, they're a
right.
bunch of snobs, they're exclusive, et cetera, et cetera. So I think sometimes pointing out how these groups, even if they do tend often to favor their own, there's just incredible spillover effects. And it's like a prosperous neighborhood where everybody, keeps up their yard and keeps up the street, and it's surrounded by blight. Well, I saw that in St. Louis because I wrote about private streets in St. Louis, just sort of like this in a way. And what ended up happening is a spillover effect, is you'd actually improve the surrounding area. They'd be essentially be free riders off of all the good things you were doing, and that is certainly true in this case. Before I go on, just a couple other thoughts, or should we just?
Please, no, continue.
Well, one thought is there's a book. You're talking about regulations, and I haven't studied this extensively. I haven't looked a lot at that issue of the decline of mutual aid, especially in the modern period. I've looked a little bit at it, but I think a lot of research could be done on that. There's a person that I think you should link up named Christy Chapin. She's been on Hannity a couple times. She's a professor. She's a libertarian, but she kind of keeps a low profile from libertarianish kind of things. She's really skittish, about perhaps for good reason, not tenured and so forth. But anyway,
That,
she wrote a book called Ensuring America's Health, which is a gold mine of historical information. One thing that I was not aware of is she pointed out that once you started getting group insurance, you would start getting a lot of employers were going to insurance companies and getting group insurance policies, right, to provide cheaper insurance and other benefits for their employees. Well, guess what? Black churches, a whole bunch of them, and a whole bunch of black fraternal societies went to these companies. Actually, the companies went to them initially and said, we'd like to write a group policy on this church. And guess what? It's against the law. So that would be a very sort of interesting thing to look at, I think. And then lastly, let me throw it again. People may disagree with me, but I think what we're pushing really does run contrary in many ways, although some would disagree, to the whole counter movement you're getting among some libertarians to push for a basic income. Because I think with a basic income, you really do undermine a lot of this. I think, but I mean that's a debatable issue. But I think that's a debate worth having.
Yeah, absolutely on that one for sure. That was some interesting adjuncts. We definitely want to do a little follow up there on Christie's situation. I like that comment there. All right, I'm going to unmute everybody here and see if we can open this up for some outside questions. David Demarest, I have you unmuted. Dr. Singleton, you're unmuted. Oh, Dr. Ruart, I didn't see you showing it. You're unmuted. And Ralph. I muted Ralph. He's in the All right, anyone have a question there for either of our, I guess, speakers here?
Yeah, I've got a question. It's sort of a two-part question. One is that we're seeing some sort of independent health insurance co-ops springing up, and they usually seem to be associated with churches or religious organizations. And I'm wondering, is that because they're able to get around some of the regulations by virtue of being religious? My second question is kind of a nuts and bolts question. If someone wanted to set up, say, a mutual aid society to provide for long-term care for those with special needs who are going to need care after their parents have passed away, what would be the biggest regulatory roadblocks that you would see that would hinder that?
I'm going to chime in for a quick minute on the first part of your question, and then anyone else can pick up on that. The religious ones actually are benevolence organizations, so they're exempt from the regulations by virtue of the fact that they're not insurance. If you're technically insurance, then you're under the thumb of the departments of insurance. But if you're just like AAA, where we all throw money in there and pay if somebody gets a tow or breaks down somewhere, that's how there are. So they were not really exempt or carved out in the ACA. They were just recognized that their existence was there. So it didn't give them permission to exist or anything. It just acknowledged that those types of organizations exist in the world. And in fact,
So
the one
what's
that Charles and I are engaged with real quicker is not religious. So it's expanded beyond just the religious confines too. What was you going to ask though?
Oh, sorry, what's the difference then between a benevolence organization and insurance? Because it seems like they're providing insurance.
They're very similar-ish, but they're functioning differently. We analogize it to the idea between a credit union and a commercial bank with shareholders. So they both deliver mortgages, but they totally operate differently on the basis of who they're serving. The credit union is serving the members, and the other is serving the corporate shareholders and the like. And so the same thing with that sharing mentality in the medical world. It's just a group of people having someone administer, like an accountant, manage the money, but we're just sharing the money with each other. We're not covering anything like when you talk about insurance. We're literally just sharing the bills when they get submitted. So yeah, it works well, and that's why, if anything, what happened was when the Affordable Care Act came along, that made everybody realize these things were actually even occurring, because up till then, no one even knew. They were just, in the dark in the corner.
There's also a religious exemption in the First Amendment that the practice of religion is not to be prohibited, the free exercise of religion. And a lot of these benevolent organizations through churches and church-related organizations are part of what they feel is their calling. There's the Christian commandment that Jesus wanted people to help the sick and help the poor and care for one another. And so there is a difficulty in both state and federal legislation in restricting the free exercise of religion. But what they will do is they will prevent these organizations from accepting money under an insurance concept, where the money is then invested and the insurance is provided. Because, oh no, that's a business, that's regulated. We have to regulate that because that's commercial activity. It's like the First Amendment as far as freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Oh yeah, you have all that, unless you're advertising. If you're speaking about a product, then suddenly your speech can't be protected. Not sure where that is in the First Amendment. I didn't see that when they were teaching it in my high school, but So as far as the second question goes, it's an extraordinarily difficult challenge to form a mutual aid society that does not fall afoul of any of these laws. And it may, in fact, be something to look at for the states that have referendum and initiative to try to get these things changed through a state ballot issue. either change the law or, better yet, change the constitution of the state to allow mutual aid societies to form and to have these kinds of these same kinds of features that they had. You know, we got along fine in the 1880s and 1890s and 1900s, all the way up until the bans started coming in the 1920s. So, you know, it may be that in those, what is it, like 30 states that have referendum and initiative, it may be something that could be addressed by having a ballot initiative.
Are there any states currently that are favorable to that or have some safe harbor laws already?
I don't think so, no. I don't think it's on their
radar.
Radar at all. They're just not. They're just not that into it.
Well, it disrupts their status quo, so I'm sure they wouldn't.
Well, right. I mean, you know, the state is really, really, really enthusiastic about protecting the state.
Right. Malf, I see you're trying to ask a question there.
Well, I was just going to say that that most states do have statutes specifically allowing mutual benefit associations and cooperatives and things like that to form, and they're right that it is an area where the lawyers are trying to make distinctions that make no difference, you know, and I think it's a great idea. But there's plenty of statutory provisions for people forming those organizations, and usually it's just as easy to form one as to form a corporation. Same basic structure. And in fact, I work with a number of Amish folk in setting up what are essentially mutual aid associations, private associations for health and well-being, and they love to operate through that sort of a private structure.
And think about it from that perspective, that's good.
Yeah.
Might be interesting to see what they have in Utah. I mean, if Utah would be a place that would be more friendly to some of these things because of the Mormon traditions of kind of mutual aid.
Somewhere to start at any rate, in other words, which is good.
It would be very worthwhile for somebody to catalog all these different regulations and rules that hold back some of these innovations.
Such a brace of it. I know with the Institute for Justice, they're pretty good, but they're working on that one little segment, which is just being able to get businesses started and all of the red tape that entails. Charles, I see you've got your hand up.
Thanks, Jeff and David and Jim. An obscure book I read a while ago was an autobiography by George Schuyler called Black Conservative. He was a journalist paid by various organizations to travel the U.S. in the 1920s to examine union conflicts. And in his book, he wrote a lot about the lodge system and mutual aid groups. And you know, Mencken really liked him a lot. If either of you come across George, it could be George Schuler or George Schuyler in sort of your investigations of that period.
Yeah, I have. I'm a big fan of his. His name is Schuyler, and he was kind of an independent leftist back in the 20s and the 30s. And during World War II, he really became much more of a kind of, I'd say almost a libertarian in some ways. He was attacking the internment of the Japanese, the atomic bomb, but he was always very, very anti-communist. And he wrote for the Pittsburgh Courier, along with Rosewalder Lane, interestingly, which was the largest black newspaper in the U.S. He was he was a senior guy there. He was a columnist. And in those columns, it'd be interesting to download some of these. He has a lot of interesting stuff in there about mutual aid, credit unions, lodges, that kind of thing. So he was very, up on that. He wrote about his childhood growing up, and his father was some Pullman porter, and go out, maybe even as a lower position than that. But he would, he remembered his father dressed up in his lodge uniform and how, as a young black kid, that was really kind of impressive to him to see that.
Very good. A lot of interesting history we've all lost sight of. That's sad to see. Anyone else have any fresh questions? Dr. Ruard, was there any kind of comments you had? I know you've been involved with your publications on healing our world.
Well, I didn't have a question. I just wanted to compliment both our speakers. I've referenced your work and really enjoyed it. Thanks for doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
What do you see? And Mary, just a little sidebar, because you're working kind of on a global basis. What are you seeing is happening in countries that maybe aren't saddled with what we've got, that have destroyed this idea of mutual aid? What are you seeing in the various countries you guys try to work in?
Are you talking to me or to our?
Yes. No, to you.
Okay. Well, you know what? One of the things that seems to be happening in, for example, the Eastern Bloc, although not universally, is that they make use of more, I guess I'd say, natural products than we do. And that's partly because they can't afford some of the medications that are coming from the US. Our development costs, as you know, are very high. So when a new drug comes on the market, it's priced pretty high these days, and some other countries can't afford it. But what they do is, most countries have a tradition of natural product healing of some sort, and that's true in Europe. It's true in China, and they have kind of a different way of looking at things. They generally, I wouldn't say they try prevention first, because I'm not sure, for example, dietary prevention and things like that are handled any better than they are here. But I do know that some of my friends in other countries have gone to their doctor with illnesses, and what they get treated with are herbs or other natural products, which is great. And we used to do that here too. One of the problems with the medical licensing, of course, is that when that came on board, that was pretty much destroyed, and because the FDA played a big role in that, because under the 62 amendments to the Food and Drug Act, you had to show effectiveness in the way the FDA wanted you to, and that took like 12 years, 14 years. So of course, natural products without patents really can't be developed that way, and so they can't make proper claims. And even though Congress has passed provisions to let them make claims, the FDA has been hauled into court because of its refusal to do so, and back again when even with the court order, they didn't do it. And the judges scolded them, and they still really haven't taken that to heart. So, that's kind of complementary, of course, to what's being talked about here in terms of regulation for healthcare providers and insurance. It's the same story, basically, as when government got involved, things got really, really difficult.
And rather distorted. And a lot of working things, if it ain't broke, why fix it type mentality. A lot of stuff got broken. Mm-hmm. So, and just look at the latest incarnation where they want to do this Medicare for all, and they said they want to end 100% private insurance. Well, that would dislodge hundreds of millions of people. So no one thinks any of this stuff through, even the most superficial level of whatever they tend to spout off. It's really sad. It just seems like a lot of it comes back to education more than anything else. I always keep hearing through all of these various events we've held that in the end, it's the individual person in America not being knowledgeable enough is allowing the bulk of all of this to occur.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, who takes economics courses these days? Our Congress people get elected without having a clue.
Popularity contests for sure.
Jeff, Charlie here. I want to emphasize kind of the way I characterize today's event in terms of the killing of personal responsibility that has accompanied the replacement of mutual aid with welfare. And what led me to that thinking was some old Walter Block videos where he was talking about the dissolution of the black family that occurred because of welfare. His point was that marriage rates with black families were the same as whites up until the 60s. Maybe it started going down a bit before then, because welfare started a bit in the 30s, not just the 60s. But even with the experience Jeff, you and I have with group healthcare versus individual healthcare, I think this is a really important topic that we can't let go. We're kind of all over the place with these weekly webinars, and that's intentional, because the right to pursue happiness encompasses every issue. But every once in a while, we come across an issue that is so important that David is right. We do need to get the PhD students and scholars to examine, how did mutual aid disappear? How can we bring it back? Because the replacement of mutual aid by welfare has killed responsibility. And so many free market folks take it for granted that, yeah, we have to have a safety net. But what kind of safety net? One run by the government, the status quo, or David keeps raising this basic income guarantee that some right-wingers are talking about and libertarians. No, we need to really talk about old-time mutual aid and bringing it back through these associations. Trump just liberalized association health plans. David and Jim have talked to these fraternal associations about offering more benefits. Brittany discussed a secular mutual aid for specialized long-term care. There is demand out there for better welfare, for basic needs, and we used to handle it through the market 100 years ago through mutual aid. How can we bring it back, and how important is this issue? That's what I want to kind of talk about.
Well, real quick on that thought, because really they've always seemed to be replacing the functionality. So I'm going to displace this mutual aid thing because now we can deliver that same service, so to speak. But what they're missing in all of these that we've talked about, regardless whether it's health or whatever it is the camaraderie and that synergy of the society that was sort of became, like when you say they did excoriate the fraternities, that mutual togetherness is really what's half the battle, not just getting your medical bills paid.
Well, on that, years ago, I was at some conference and somebody mentioned about, Saul Alinsky, who's kind of gotten a bad name, but Alinsky back in whenever he was doing his thing, I guess in the 40s and the 50s, would go out to these poor neighborhoods and he would try to organize the poor, right? And some of these Alinskyites were, complaining because Alinsky's original recommendation was, if you want to organize the poor, you've got to link in with the existing social organizations, businesses. You've got to link in with them first. You got to go in and find out who's kind of running things in that area. And some of these Alinskyyites were complaining years later, there's nobody there. I mean, there's no link left. And, it's become, and you destroy the social infrastructure. And of course, as has been written about by people like Jane Jacobs, you destroy the social infrastructure, the physical infrastructure soon follows. And you become a kind of Hobbesian world. And this is, created in great part by the welfare state. And I think it's worth us, rather than talking about things like a basic income plan, talking about how the welfare state has really done a number.
And it's failed. It fails people who are poor. I have lived in poor neighborhoods in New York and in Houston and the Kansas City area and now in Dayton. And I experienced it on a daily basis that my neighbors were not able to get any kind of good service out of the charity hospital, out of the free hospital, out of Medicare. One of my neighbors was repeatedly going to the hospital for a foot injury. He's an overweight male in his 60s. So why didn't they check his blood for diabetes? When one of his friends took him to a private doctor, that was the first thing that was tested for. Oh yeah, you've got a wound on an extremity that doesn't heal. Well, by the time that happened, they had to go to radical surgery to save this guy's life. And he lost his foot. The thing that is not part of our conversation as a country, I think, is that the government healthcare and the government food services and all of the other government services are terrible. They do a horrible job. They do, giving them more money isn't going to make them any better at what they do because they don't care. There's no community. The nice thing about mutual aid is that it necessarily requires an involved community of people who know each other and care about each other. And that does more than anything else to address these problems. And the government bureaucracy cannot ever do that because the bureaucrat gets paid whether they care or not. And sometimes they get paid whether they show up or not.
And one thing I would say, Jim, the one little thing I would correct you on is when you said that they don't care. They don't care about us, but they care about each other that all work down there at that bureaucracy because they have Friday parties and celebrate birthdays, and they understand whether they realize it or not the value of community, but they don't care about the people they serve, and that's the disconnect for sure. Dr. Singleton, are you there? Still online? I know you've been dealing with some of these. Yeah, I was going to say, why don't you put a couple cents in here, because I know you've been dealing with some of the up and downs of the realities of trying to get to reality for consumers in the medical world.
Well, everyone has said it, and it's so true. Education, education, education. The patients have to know what the problems are, what's out there, and what the alternatives are. And our big problem, and I continually see this, is like right now we're preaching to the choir. I love listening to these things because I get some great lines out of it and to use when I do have the opportunity to speak to groups and speak to patients, or and I slip this stuff in. I teach elder abuse classes to medical personnel and police personnel, and kind of I'm always slipping this kind of thing in and asking people, if you had a way where you had a smaller community that was financing your healthcare, would you like that? Yes, yes, yes. We feel more of a connection to the people and to the doctors and all this. And so, as Jeff said, people want this. It's just too many people don't know that it's out there. And it remains our biggest problem. How do you let people know?
And again, that's our purpose here, is to some degree start to figure out other ways to get the word around and let others that should have knowledge of it and have connections to help promote it. We got to try to do our little part in this little corner here. So it is pretty amazing.
Well, if I could suggest something,
Please.
Something that was very powerful to me, and which is related to this topic, is years ago that I was at the Institute for Humane Studies, and there was someone who gave a presentation and then showed a film about these independent private schools, which are all over Africa and India, because you have public schools, but they're just absolute disasters. So sometimes very poor parents are getting together through mutual aid and providing schooling, and the regulations, they're just, the tuition is very low, and has a lot to do with the regulations and so forth. Now, that is of an interest to it by itself, that these schools are in all these poor neighborhoods everywhere. But what was particularly effective for me was there was a film done about it, which went in there, showed the school, showed the people, showed the kids, and how well they were doing. And if you want to just see publicity for freedom in that area, there was nothing better than that. And something like that done for healthcare. And I presume not only in the United States, that in the world there are probably, with the breakdown of public services in a lot of these countries, there's probably mutual aid bubbling up from the ground, some amazing examples like that we just don't know about. But someone could go in and actually physically show what's going on. Mm-hmm. And that would be very powerful, I think. But you need to get some documentary filmmakers, which is not my forte. But if you could get some libertarian documentary filmmakers, sick them on that issue, there's a gold mine out there.
Mm-hmm. Some interesting food for thought. Thinking about the Freedom Fest that takes place in July, they actually have a film festival as a part of that, and there's some interesting filmmakers. So I appreciate being on these calls too. You've given me some good ideas to get some other synergies going. So it's important that we all do, because like everywhere we've been describing this, and Mary with stuff overseas, whatever, it always comes down to the person picking up and making something happen. Like the people that have decided to come to this type of an event, everybody else, I don't know what they're blithely doing. I mean, they're more concerned about that blown play in some football game than anything of any real consequence, sadly. So, but somebody's got to kind of get out there and be that leader in those synergies. And I think getting stuff where like granular, like those videos, like you said, and things of that nature, which is what people seem to be able to respond to these days, memes and so on, is an area to also start to explore what to do. I would say that's a really great day we had today here. We're just rolling on to our end of the meeting here, so I think we've reached a good conclusion spot. I was going to say, Charles, if you want to just kind of remind us for a quick moment who we're going to have coming up next week.
Sure. And before I do, is there anyone with a last-minute thought or question?
I just wanted to mention that I'm sending you guys, Charles and Jeff, a link to that video on mutual aid based on Ron Long's stuff. So it goes over some of these facts, and it does that documentary film thing that is helpful in educating other people, and you can pass it on to the
definitely will want to. I've consolidated notices just to tell everybody a little housekeeping that every Monday the goal is to send out a notice about who's coming on Wednesday, and also have the link, and like what just Jim talked about, all the links contained in that same email about what happened last week. So that's kind of all contained in one singular notice. Go ahead, continue, Charles. Sorry.
No problem. And thank you, Jim. That would be perfect. So the next 4 weeks, February, the Wednesdays, we have Judge Jim Gray, who does alternative dispute resolution. He was Gary Johnson's Libertarian presidential VP candidate in 2012. And he's going to try to cover the gamut of legal reform issues, overcriminalization. So that's a real large area. So if you have any Institute for Justice type friends who are trying to use the legal system to bring liberty back or offer alternative ways to adjudicate disputes, that's a big issue in liberty utopia land. So that's next week. Please help populate that one. Carrie McDonald from FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, the week after that, on the troubles from the medical establishment and the family courts for parents who try to save their kids from bad government schools. Then, gosh, the name escapes me.
Roman Bueller.
Roman Bueller, thanks, and old counsel for Speaker Gingrich on how do we use the amendment process to gum up the works on expensive regulations to allow entrepreneurs to do their thing. And then finally, we have the famous character Joel Salatin from the Shenandoah. He's a farmer and an activist, and local food farm freedom is a big and broad issue. How do we get access to safe food from the big agribusinesses? And so please join us for that. Another group of speakers for March, that's all filled up for the schedule. Stay tuned. Please invite folks to join us. Submit ideas and other topics, and if anyone on this call wants to present, let Jeff or me know. We have Wednesdays to the balance of the year. So thanks very much, Jeff.
That was excellent. Thanks, everyone, for making it today. Again, I'll release the recordings. And then as time is going by, we're also releasing these up onto some other platforms, too, as we modify these things and make them more publishable. So I'll keep you posted as that occurs.